So we've got everything disassembled on this machine, and we got the new brake here, and you can see the little piece of tread, looks like an old tire in here on this brake pad, and see it's not rusted like the last one was. This one's also got all the keepers on the back like it's supposed to have on these bolts here. Now the only thing it didn't have was this bolt, which you've got to have. Our old one had, well actually I just lost the old one, but usually they're stripped out from people adjusting or putting the wrong size standard wrench in it instead of a metric. So what you'll need is a metric 5 lock nut and a bolt, and I don't have it. It's about an inch and a quarter long, but we're going to start installing this piece back on there. And when we go to put it back on, it's got some fairly close tolerances, so when we go to set it back on here, we're just going to be careful about tightening it all back up. I think I mentioned this before. We'll just start a little bit here and then progress on around. But before we go too far with that, I'm going to go ahead and put my shaft and everything back on, or my key on the shaft rather. You see I'm using a coated pair of pliers. That's not the optimal thing to use. Use a piece of wood or a piece of brass. Don't ever hit this, never hit steel with steel, because when you've got something with this tight tolerance that you've got to insert back into a female joint, you know, when you start boogering up the ends of this, guess what ain't gonna fit? That. So you don't want to have to take a file to it or some emery cloth. So just before, the bigger hammer is not always the right answer. So we've got that piece on there. We're going to go ahead and set this new brake on here. And it doesn't really matter how you put it on there, but what I usually try to do is put it back the way it came, which is with the wire kind of facing back out towards the side of the side where the junction box is. So I'm just going to set this down on here, and we see it kind of lines up pretty well right there on those holes. All right. Let me just get that one started. Get that one started. Get that one started. Now, we can just run each one of them down a little bit. See, it starts to get fairly tight there. That's why you got to be careful not to let them kind of get out of sync. Tighten one side all the way down. It can even bend these screws, and we don't want that. Ah, that screw's just bent. Have to see if that affects performance or not. And the way we would know if it did or not was if we see when this, you see there's a pretty large gap here. That gap's not going to be here once we get done adjusting it. But the issue you might have with it would be that the gap's kind of uneven, and when it goes to draw in, part of it draws in and part of it doesn't. That would be some of the inconsistencies we found with these things. So we're going to have this gap here. That's fairly common until we set this new fan on here. Now like I said, it's supposed to come with a new one, but that don't mean you're going to get one. It's also supposed to come with a new fan, but that also don't mean you're going to get one. But and I've also seen where they've had cracks in them right here around it, so you just want to watch for that. Now the big issue with a lot of these motors is that the shafts, when they're sending them back from the factory, the shafts are pinged. And what I mean by pinged is they'll actually go in there with a center punch and they'll hit some spots around the shaft. And what that does is it causes part of it to expand, and it causes it to fit snugger on this, because they had some issues with these where they fit too loose and they were backing off and they were rattling and making a lot of sound noise. It's irritating folks, but primarily because these were backing off and losing their adjustment. But so they put a couple pings in them to make it where it didn't. That problem was they put too many pings in them, and the brake gets stuck in place, and when it's too tight and you need to back it off, guess what? It won't come back. So if you've got one where it's too tight, what you would have to do is you'd have to come in here, snug it up, and then back it to the point you wanted, and then come in here and kind of put some pressure here to back this fan off to get the pressure off of it. So to remedy that, we pull the whole assembly off, we get a piece of emery cloth, and we put it on the shaft here, hold it in place, and we run the motor at 110 volts straight up to the 2 motor leads, and run it till it polishes it off nice and clean, and then we'll start from scratch. Now this one didn't have that issue, because you can see just how easy I can push this one down and it comes up. So that's optimal, that's what we want. So we're going to go ahead and install this adjustment screw here and show you the correct way to do it. Now you see there's a nut on the end of here, and that nut sits down in a hex-shaped slot inside the end of the motor shaft, and that's what holds that in place. That's why I don't have to have anything in there to hold it. So we're just going to start tightening until it goes all the way down. And it's actually going to, you'll see the screws are going to disappear here shortly, and when it does, it's going to start drawing down, closing that gap right here, and we can see that happening. And then when it makes contact there, right there, now it's going to start closing this gap. Okay, let me check the camera, make sure you can still see it. Yeah, you got a pretty good view of it. All right, so watch this gap go about to nothing. See that? And I bottomed out right there. Okay, don't want to over tighten it. That's how we mess up these screws in the first place. So here is the correct way to adjust it. This may vary. There ain't no set there ain't no set number of what you have to back off. What you have to look for is this crack right here. You don't want it touching, but you don't want it so open that it looks like that. You see this? You could probably slide a credit card and a half through there. That is the most open you would want. What we would really like is something more like, there's tighten, and then we're going to back off a quarter of a turn, okay? And that looks like, as I'm pressing down, I don't see it moving at all. Okay, I just moved it probably an eighth of a turn, and I saw it lift just a little bit. I can see just a paper thin little gap right there. I can just get my fingernail through it. And for testing purposes, now if I run my hand on it, I can feel that there's a slight drag to it, but I can move it, you know, and that's about what we want. Notice that it's hard to see this gap, and if it's actually in person, you can kind of see it. When we mount it back on the machine, when this draws in and out, we can actually see it operate. So this is how you install it. This is how you adjust it. And the next step will be hooking up our rectifier and hooking up our fuse link and getting the brake wired in and making sure all this is done correct. We'll do that in the next video.